The return slot jammed. A folded paper was wedged between the pages of his book. Kaito pulled it free. The handwriting was not his own. Chapter 7. The silence after the confession, it echoed everything you never dared say aloud.
Those had been my exact thoughts, but they never left my lips.
3 weeks earlier, he hadn't even known her name. He'd walked to the counter expecting nothing more than a stamped due date. The assistant looked up. Soft violet hair, thin glasses, and then a sudden, fierce blush.
Why is she reacting like that? I only returned a book.
Her hands trembled around the scanner. She stamped the book without meeting his eyes again. He walked away, but that blush followed him, a secret he suddenly needed to unravel. The next afternoon, Kaito returned to the library with a different purpose.
I need to see if it was a fluke, or if she blushes for everyone.
He approached the counter. Misaki's face went crimson the moment she saw him.
Again, it's not random. It's me.
He selected a heavy volume, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, an absurd choice for a literature student. When he placed it on the counter, Misaki's hands shook. The scanner beeped erratically. She fumbled the due date slip, nearly dropping the book. Her blush deepened to scarlet.
This isn't just shyness. Something about my book combos triggers her.
He decided to push further. Tomorrow, Edo poetry. The day after, vintage cookbooks. And he'd watch her like a manuscript he couldn't put down. The next day, Kaito placed a worn anthology of Edo poetry on the counter.
Here comes the blush again. But this time, I'm watching the details.
Misaki's blush was fiercer than before, her porcelain skin turning scarlet to her temples. The volume trembled in her grip. She could barely hold the scanner steady. She stamped the due date slip with a shaking hand and slid the book back across the counter.
Poetry made it worse. It's not the subject, it's me or the combination of books. But why?
He decided to observe her from a distance. He found a study carrel with a clear view of the counter.
Let's see how she handles ordinary students. Does she turn red for them too?
A group of students approached. She smiled politely, scanned their books with ease. No blush. The reaction was uniquely his. He needed one more test, something wildly unexpected. The following day, Kaito approached with a vintage cookbook, a strange mismatch for a literature major.
If she blushes at this too, then it's not the books. It's definitely personal.
Misaki's hands trembled the moment she saw the title. The book nearly slipped from her fingers. She caught it against her chest, but the blush had already spread to her neck.
She almost dropped it. That's fear, not just embarrassment. What is she afraid of?
That afternoon, he positioned himself in the stacks to watch her counter interactions. She handled other students with quiet professionalism. Her expression remained calm.
Not a single blush. I'm the only trigger. Why am I so special to her?
He walked back to the counter to check out another book. The moment their eyes met, her cheeks ignited. Kaito began to wonder if she recognized him beyond the library, a hidden link he couldn't yet name. Later in his dorm, Kaito couldn't shake the image of Misaki's trembling hands and crimson face.
She's reacting to something specific. But what could I have done to make her so afraid?
Ryo burst in without knocking and threw himself into the chair.
You look like you've been cursed. Spill it.
There's a library assistant. She turns bright red only when I'm there. I tested it.
Only you, dude? That's the biggest green light I've ever heard. She wants you, no question.
But it's not just a crush. The blushing is extreme, like she's terrified of being discovered. I don't know, Ryo. It feels different. Almost like she knows something I don't.
You're reading too many mystery novels? Just ask her out and see what happens.
Kaito wasn't convinced, but he knew one thing. The library awaited him again tomorrow. The next morning, Kaito arrived early. From the entrance, he watched Misaki at the counter.
There's that blush again. But today I notice a tiny silver book charm dangling from her necklace.
She avoided his eyes completely, fingers trembling over the scanner.
This isn't cold professionalism. It's a deliberate, desperate avoidance.
He stepped forward, and she fumbled with a stack of returns, pushing her glasses up nervously.
Why do her movements feel so familiar? Like a melody I can't quite place.
The book charm swayed as she finally looked up, only to immediately turn scarlet.
A book pendant. She's a reader, an obsessive one that resonates more than I expected.
She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so delicate it stopped his breath.
This isn't just a mystery anymore. I'm being drawn into something, into her.
That evening, Kaito retreated to his dorm and opened his laptop. The screen glowed with the familiar layout of Whispered Margins, the anonymous literary blog he'd obsessed over for a year.
Every post here is like a letter addressed to a stranger I know intimately.
Tonight's entry dissected a novel he'd just finished. The analysis mirrored his own unspoken thoughts exactly.
I didn't tell anyone about that theory. How could they know?
He scrolled through the archives, finding dozens of posts that felt unnervingly personal.
We've been reading the same books at the same time, but who writes like this? Who understands me so well?
The blog was his hidden sanctuary, a literary soul that breathed in parallel with his own.
Who are you? Whispered Margins. It feels like you're writing these posts just for me.
He refreshed the page, but the night offered no new words, only the hum of the laptop and the weight of unanswered questions. The following afternoon, Kaito returned a novel at the counter and headed to the stacks. Hours later, passing the reshelving cart, the same book caught his eye. A white slip peeked from its pages. He hesitated, then slipped the folded paper free. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar, not his own.
Who wrote this? And how is it inside my book?
The final lines echoed in his head. The silence after the confession, it said everything you never dared speak.
Those were my private thoughts. Exactly my thoughts, down to the very words. No one knows this. I didn't tell anyone about that passage. So who?
He scanned the quiet aisles. The library felt suddenly like a locked room in a mystery novel.
Someone in this building has read my mind, and they left a calling card.
Back in his dorm, Kaito spread the note on his desk beside his laptop. The handwriting seemed unfamiliar, yet the words felt oddly personal.
This note reads like a fragment of a blog post, a very specific literary one.
He opened Whispered Margins and scrolled through recent entries. The cadence of the prose was disturbingly similar.
The same rhythm, the same obsession with silence and confession. Could the blogger be in my library?
He compared the note's handwriting with the typed text on the screen. No direct match, but the voice was unmistakable.
What if the blog author isn't just some anonymous literary lover? What if it's someone here on campus, maybe even...
His heart quickened. A library insider, a student or staff, could slip a note into any returned book.
The blogger reads the same books as me, always. And now this note mirrors my unspoken thoughts. That's too much coincidence.
Kaito decided then he would return to the library tomorrow, not as a reader, but as a detective. He needed to know who.
I'll watch closer. Maybe even leave a response. If they can reach me through books, I can reach back.
The next morning, Kaito found a secluded spot with a clear view of both the counter and the reshelving cart.
I need to see if she interacts with the cart when no one's looking.
Misaki wheeled a cart of returns into the main aisle. She paused at a worn volume, glanced around, then slipped a folded paper between its pages.
That's it. She's the one. She put something in that book.
He waited until she was occupied at the counter, then quietly approached the cart. The book she'd touched was a recent return of his own, a collection of German poetry. His heart pounded.
She's been reading my returns and responding.
He didn't open the note. Instead, he replaced it and stepped back, a plan crystallizing.
I'll write my own note and leave it in my next return. Let's see who answers.
He retreated to a quiet study carrel, pulling out a pen and a scrap of paper to draft his first message. He wrote a small, folded note. "Who are you? Do you know me?" He tucked the note inside a book of contemporary poetry he was ready to return. At the counter, he handed the book to Misaki, who took it with a trembling hand. She scanned the barcode without a word, but the blush crept up her neck.
Did she notice the extra page? Or is she too nervous to see?
To avoid suspicion, he also checked out a modern thriller, his real purpose hidden beneath the dust jacket. The scanner beeped. An ordinary transaction, but his pulse raced like a fugitive's.
It was done. The folded message now rested in the book, waiting for its recipient.
He retreated to the stacks, trying to focus on a random page, but his eyes refused to obey.
But would anyone answer? Or was he chasing a ghost written in ink?
The next afternoon, Kaito approached the counter with feigned calm. Misaki met his eyes for a brief, charged moment.
She's not avoiding my gaze. That's new.
She slid a book toward him. The thriller he'd checked out yesterday now returned early. A folded corner of paper peeked out.
Already? How could there be a reply so fast?
He took the book without a word, his fingers brushing the hidden note. Retreating to a quiet aisle, he unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The note read, "I know you. I've always known you."
Always? Who are you?
Chills traced his spine. The note was proof someone in this library was watching him, and had been for a long time.
I'm not playing a game. I'm stepping into one that's already been played for months.
Kaito reread the note 10 times in a shadowed aisle, the words burrowing into his chest.
The handwriting's gentle, like hers. The tone matches her hidden glances. It has to be Misaki.
He moved to a table with a view of the counter. Misaki was reshelving, but her eyes kept drifting toward him.
She's checking if I'm watching. What are you planning to slip next, Misaki?
On a hunch, he retreated into the deepest, most remote aisle, where her cart usually paused. Minutes later, Misaki appeared with a book in hand. She glanced around, then slid a folded paper between its pages.
Right there. That's proof, but I still don't know what the note says.
He waited until her footsteps faded, then crept toward the shelf.
Should I read it now? No, I need to know who, not just what. I'll wait and watch her next move.
But the book pulsed in his hand like a held breath, its secret pressed between the pages. He pulled the book from the shelf and opened it. The folded note was tucked inside, and on the outer fold, a name was written. It read, Kaito.
She knows my name. Not just my library card identity, but me.
His thumb traced the ink. This wasn't a random note hidden in a random book. It was meant for him specifically.
So is she aware that I know? Does she know I've been watching?
He almost unfolded it right there, but the weight of the library's silence pressed in. Not here. Not where anyone could see.
I need to read this in private, where every word can land without interruption.
He slid the note into his jacket pocket and walked out of the stacks as if the floor might collapse beneath him. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, but Kaito's world had narrowed to the folded paper in his pocket.
Tonight, in my room, I'll finally know what she has to say to me.
He locked his door, sat at the desk, and unfolded the note with careful fingers. The note read, "In the silences between chapters, I've heard your voice. You write your thoughts in invisible ink, and I've been reading them for months."
This is exactly how Whispered Margins writes. The same poetic cadence.
He opened his laptop and pulled up the blog, scrolling to a post from 2 weeks ago. The syntax, the metaphors, the obsession with hidden words, it was identical.
It's her. The shy library assistant with the trembling hands is the writer I've been obsessed with for a year.
He leaned back, staring at the screen, then at the note. 2 obsessions collapsing into one.
She's been writing to me the whole time. But does she know I'm the commenter she always replies to?
He could confront her tomorrow. Or he could keep writing back, letting the pages speak first.
I'll wait. I need to understand why she built this secret bridge before I cross it.
He spent the next hour scrolling through Whispered Margins with a detective's eye.
Every post I loved, they all respond to comments I left under a pseudonym.
He traced the threads, his anonymous questions, her elaborate replies, a dialogue hidden in plain sight. The blog wasn't just a public journal, it was a conversation crafted for one reader.
She wrote about books I mentioned. She used phrases that echoed my messages. This is for me.
He scrolled back to the earliest posts, dated almost a year ago, the month he'd started commenting.
A whole year. She built this entire blog just to speak to me. without ever knowing if I'd hear.
The room felt smaller. The weight of a year of unspoken words pressed against his ribs.
But does she know the commenter is Kaito? Or does she think I'm just a reader?
He couldn't ask yet. He had to protect the fragile truth before it shattered. The next afternoon, Kaito entered the library with a stranger's knowledge and a friend's secret affection.
She looks up. The same blush spills across her cheeks, but now I see it carries all her secret words.
He slid a collection of French poetry across the counter, watching her hands tremble around the scanner. Her blush was the same, but Kaito's chest ached with new warmth. Every tremor was a syllable of the language she'd built just for him. Later in the stacks, he opened the book and found a small handwritten note in the margin. "You chose this because of page 42. I remember."
I did choose it for page 42. She's been inside my reading diary, page by page.
He ran his finger over the delicate script. The ink was real, yet it felt like stepping into the blog's most intimate passage.
I want to write back, but if I do, the bubble might burst.
He glanced toward the counter. Misaki was reshelving, and their eyes met for a second longer than before.
You're telling me everything in silence, and I'm too afraid to answer aloud.
Back in his dorm, Kaito uncapped a pen and wrote in the margin, "Page 42 was the reason I first loved this book." Days passed in ink. Each return carried small confessions, a favorite line, a quiet fear, a dream set in a fictional town.
We've never spoken aloud, but she knows my silence is better than any voice I've heard.
He replied to her notes in the margins, his handwriting neat but hesitant, each word chosen like a step on thin ice. One evening, he opened a returned novel and found her latest words. "Do you ever feel like the books are the only ones who listen?"
She's lonelier than I imagined. This ink is her only voice, and she's using it to reach for me.
His pen trembled before he wrote back, "The books listen, but they don't answer." "I do." He closed the book, his pulse loud in his ears. That was the most honest sentence he'd ever written.
I'm falling for someone I've only met in the margins. Is that insane? Or is it the only real thing I've felt?
He didn't sleep. The bubble held, but the weight beneath it grew heavier with every passing night. The next afternoon, Misaki's blush was deeper and her hands shook as she slid a slim volume of modern poetry toward him.
She avoided my eyes, but her fingers lingered a second too long on the cover. Something's different.
In his room, he opened to a dog-eared page and found her handwriting, "I think about you when I read." Beside the words, she'd drawn a tiny, trembling heart.
She's never drawn a heart before. This isn't just a literary confession, it's a personal one.
Sleep refused to come. At 2 a.m., he opened his laptop and visited Whispered Margins. A new post glowed on the screen. It described the terror of reaching for someone across an invisible divide, terrified they'd retreat.
This is my own fear written in her voice. We're both paralyzed by the same silence.
He closed the laptop and stared at the dark ceiling. The weight of inaction pressed harder than any rejection.
I have to break this silence. But how do you step out of a story you've only lived in the margins?
The next afternoon, Kaito found Rio at their usual cafe table. A folded note hid in his jacket pocket.
You look like you're about to combust. What's eating you now?
I found this in a book. Read it and tell me what you see.
Rio scanned the note, a tame margin confession about shared solitude.
That's a love letter, man. Someone's been waiting a long time to say this to you.
A love letter. She wrote me a love letter. My silence already has an answer.
Wait, is this from the library girl who blushes? Told you she was into you.
No, it's not her. Just someone from a forum. Forget it.
Sure, not her, but your face is screaming otherwise. Just make a move before someone else reads the book first.
I'm in love with Misaki. The words are there. I just have to find the right book to put them in.
Kaito walked into the library that afternoon with a heavy book under his arm and a heavier secret in his chest. Misaki's hands fumbled with the scanner, her usual blush now rimmed with an unsteady tension.
She's shaking more than usual. Something's about to break.
I read the one you returned. Your notes, they were just like my own thoughts.
She knows. She's read my margin replies. She knows I'm the one who wrote back.
Misaki froze, her words hanging like a glass orb suspended midair, a second from shattering. The scanner beeped once, then silence. Neither of them moved.
If I speak now, everything changes. But my voice is trapped behind the same fear that's written all over her face.
He took the book, her fingers brushing his for a searing instant. Then he turned and walked away without a word. The air between them remained taut as a held breath, and neither had the courage to release it. Kaito walked the long path from the library, Misaki's whispered words replaying on an endless loop.
Just like my own thoughts. She meant the margin notes. She couldn't have known unless she read them herself. But those notes were in books I checked out. Only a library worker could access them before reshelving. She is the blogger. She is the note writer. Her face, when she said it, she wasn't just commenting. She was confessing. She knows I wrote back to her. Why didn't I say anything? I just stood there like a coward.
Back in his dorm, he couldn't sit still. The silence he'd maintained now felt like a cage.
I have to know the full truth. No more games. I'll ask her directly. Did you write the blog for me?
He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and uncapped his pen. His hand shook as he wrote. 3 words stared back at him. Was it me? He folded it small enough to fit inside a paperback. Tomorrow, he would return the book and ask the question that had been echoing for a year. The next day, Kaito placed the paperback on the counter, the folded question tucked inside like a secret plea. Misaki opened the book, her eyes catching the slip of paper immediately. Her blush deepened to a shade he'd never seen.
Was it me? I know it's you. I've known for months. The blog, whispered Margins. I wrote it for you.
She knew. All along. The blog was a love letter to me, and I never saw it.
The air left the room. The library's hum faded into a distant whisper, every sound swallowed by the weight of her words. Misaki's hands trembled on the counter, her confession now an irreversible line crossed.
A year of words, a year of blushes. It was all for me, and I have no voice to answer.
She looked up and met his eyes. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't a mystery. It was a choice. Kaito stumbled to a reading table, his legs weak under the weight of her words.
Every post I read, every word I obsessed over, it was her, this whole time.
Back in his dorm, he opened his laptop. The familiar layout of whispered margins now felt like a letter addressed solely to him. Each post that had once mystified him now read as a confession, every phrase a coded message meant for his eyes.
I think about you when I read. That post from June, I thought it was about a book. It was about me.
He saw the timeline with new clarity. Every blush at the counter, every note in the margins, every blog entry had been part of one continuous, silent declaration.
I feel like an idiot. And also, like the luckiest fool alive. She loves me. She's loved me for a year.
But terror soon followed the elation. What could he possibly offer that matched the magnitude of her hidden devotion? He lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the question now reversed. Not whether she loved him, but whether he deserved it. And beneath the fear, a truth he could no longer deny. He was in love with Misaki, not the blogger, but the girl who blushed behind the counter. That evening, Kaito returned as the library lights dimmed. Misaki was still at the counter, as if waiting.
Why didn't you just tell me?
She looked down, her fingers gripping the counter's edge until her knuckles whitened.
Because I was terrified. And because I wanted you to love the words before the person?
Her voice cracked on the last word, as if confessing to a long-hidden crime.
She wanted to be loved for her soul before her face. That was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed.
The silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It was a bridge made of ink and trembling hands.
I still can't say it, but she's already heard me louder than any voice could reach.
And for the first time, he understood the weight of every blush she'd ever worn just for him. He walked back to his dorm in a haze, the streetlights blurring past like forgotten book pages. Inside his dorm, he collapsed onto the bed, but sleep refused to come within 1,000 miles.
Her terrified eyes, the blog's cadence wrapping around my own words. They are one, the girl behind the counter and the genius behind whispered margins. I love both completely.
A strange calm replaced the terror, a sharp, driving purpose crystallizing in his chest.
She gave me a year of hidden words. I need to give her something permanent.
He sat up, staring at the blank wall, an idea forming in the hush of the night.
A poem. No, a proposal poem, hidden in the back of a book where our story was born.
His gaze fell on the stack of returned books, and he knew exactly which one would carry his answer. By morning, he would hold the ink that could rewrite everything. At the campus cafe, Ryo found Kaito nursing a cold coffee, his face pale but lit with a strange certainty.
You look like you've seen a ghost who wrote you a sonnet. Spill it?
The blushing library assistant, Misaki. She's the blogger behind Whispered Margins. She's been writing to me for a year.
Wait, the anonymous blog you've obsessed over? That's her? The quiet girl who blushes and drops things.
Kaito told him everything, the notes in the margins, the coded blog posts, the confession whispered across the counter.
She loved you before you even knew her face. That's not a crush, that's a vow. You don't walk away from that.
I'm not walking. I'm going to write a marriage proposal poem and hide it in the back of a book. Something she can't miss.
A proposal? Dude, you're either the biggest romantic or the craziest person I know. Maybe both.
He's right, but this is the only answer worthy of her hidden devotion.
Ryo clapped him on the shoulder. Then go write the best poem of your life. She's waited a year. She can wait one more day. Back in his dorm, Kaito smoothed a sheet of paper and dipped his pen in ink. The desk lamp cast a golden circle, isolating this moment from the rest of the world.
This poem must hold every blush, every margin note, every breath I held back.
He began with the crimson sunrise of her cheeks, the blog's secret voice, the trembling silences. Line after line, he poured out the confession he'd been composing since that first day at the counter. Then, with a steady hand, he added the final question. Will you marry the man who found you in the margins? He stared at the words, his own heart suspended in the ink. Gently, he folded the page and slid it into the back of the vintage poetry book. The book sat on his desk like a sealed vow, waiting for dawn. The morning sun slanted through the library windows as Kaito walked in, the vintage book heavy in his hand.
This is it. The book that started everything now holds my last hidden sentence.
Misaki stood behind the counter, her blush faint but present, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. He stepped forward, the book trembling slightly in his grip, and placed it on the counter between them.
This is a return, but before you reshelve it, read the back end paper.
Her fingers paused on the cover, her gaze flickering to his face before lifting the worn book. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. This wasn't an ordinary transaction. Misaki opened the back cover, her hands as unsteady as the first day he'd seen her. The poem lay there, his confession folded into the fabric of their silent world. The question he'd never dared to ask aloud now rested entirely in her trembling hands. Misaki began to read, her brow furrowing as the first lines unfolded. Familiar words from a stranger who wasn't a stranger anymore. Her lips parted as she recognized the echoes of their hidden conversations, the blog's secret cadence woven into every line. When she reached the final question, her breath caught, a sharp, silent gasp that made the book tremble. Tears welled in her indigo eyes, spilling over before she could stop them.
Please don't let those be sad tears. Please let them be the kind that say yes.
She read it again, her finger tracing the words with the reverence of someone touching a sacred text. The heirloom book charm on her necklace caught the light as she trembled, a tiny silver witness to the moment.
She hasn't spoken. She's just reading it over and over like she's afraid the words will vanish.
A tear slid down her cheek and landed on the page, blurring the ink of the question she couldn't yet answer. Kaito's heart pounded against his ribs, but he didn't dare speak. The library held its breath. Misaki looked up from the poem, tears still tracing lines down her cheeks, her indigo eyes searching his.
You found me. In the margins, just like you said.
Kaito's throat locked. He could only nod, a single motion that held a library of unsaid words. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand, the book charm on her necklace catching the light.
I never dared to hope you'd read that deeply, that you'd find me.
Kaito's hand rested on the counter, inches from hers, but he didn't close the gap. Not yet. The silence between them was no longer a wall, it was a threshold.
I've been waiting for someone to read me. For a year, you've been that someone.
Then, a tiny smile formed on her lips, the kind that carries both tears and the promise of an answer. Misaki's hand dipped below the counter and emerged with a small scrap of paper. She scribbled something quickly, her pen trembling as it danced across the surface. Then she slid it across the counter. A string of digits with a single word above. Coffee?
Her number. And coffee. This is really happening.
His hand moved, fingers closing around the slip as if it were the most fragile page in existence. He stared at the neat handwriting, the numbers blurring for a moment as his pulse roared in his ears. He looked up, and Misaki was watching him, her blush deeper than any book cover had ever been.
The librarian who blushes when I check out books just asked for my number.
He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Only a smile, his first real, unguarded smile in what felt like years. The library's quietest pair had finally breached the silence, one handwritten digit at a time. Kaito looked from the slip in his hand to her face, the 6-digit invitation hanging in the golden air between them.
Yes. Coffee. Tonight?
Tonight?
She nodded, emotion so small yet so certain it felt like a vow. The old library clock on the wall behind her ticked once, but time refused to move, suspended in the amber glow of the desk lamp.
She said yes to the poem, and now she's agreeing to coffee. This is real.
He tucked the slip into his pocket, the digits already seared into his memory like her blush. Misaki glanced at the clock behind her, then back at him, a soft, expectant smile curling her lips.
I'll text you after your shift.
And just like that, the librarian who blushes when I check out books had asked the quietest boy on campus to coffee, and he had never heard a louder yes than the silence that followed. When the library closed, Kaito waited by the entrance, the slip now a sacred relic in his pocket. Misaki emerged without her cardigan, a simple dress beneath a light coat, her shoulder-length violet hair catching the last rays of sun. They fell into step without a word, the campus path aglow with the quiet gold of evening. Neither spoke, yet the silence wasn't hollow. It was filled with the echo of a year of words. Ahead, the warm glow of the coffee shop spilled onto the sidewalk like an invitation. He held the door open, and she ducked inside, her scent of old paper and jasmine trailing after her. They found a booth near the back, the scent of roasted coffee wrapping around them like a soft blanket. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the small table, the counter of the library now replaced by wood and ceramic. The silence held a new shape, the shape of a beginning. A barista came and took their orders. 2 lattes, one with cinnamon, like a small confession of shared detail.
Whispered margins. Why that name?
Because I always felt like my words were just notes in the margins of someone else's story. Yours?
Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, the same motion she'd made around countless book spines.
Every time you checked out a book, I'd write a post. It was the only way I could speak to you.
So those posts were replies to the books I chose, not just random musings.
Every book combination you borrowed was like a letter to me. I just returned the letters.
She blushed, but it was no longer the blush of fear. It was the blush of something finally finding its home.
You turned the library into a secret language only we could read.
Misaki laughed softly, a sound lighter than air, yet it echoed with the weight of a year's unspoken words. Kaito's expression softened, the cafe's warmth suddenly eclipsed by a deeper, older gratitude.
Your blog saved me during my loneliest nights. I'd refresh it at 2 a.m. just to feel like someone understood.
Misaki's indigo eyes glistened, her fingers tightening around the ceramic cup.
I wrote every post hoping you'd read it. Every single one. I was terrified you'd hate it.
Hate it? Misaki. I loved every word. I fell in love with your words before I ever knew your face.
Her breath caught, a tear slipping free even as a smile trembled on her lips.
Every blog entry, every margin note, It was like you were writing letters directly to my soul.
Their hands rested on the table, inches apart, the space between them charged with a year of unspoken confessions.
I never imagined you'd feel that way. I just wanted you to know someone out there understood you.
Kaito closed the distance, covering her trembling hand with his own. The first touch, but it felt like 100 letters finally delivered. The coffee shop's warm murmur seemed to recede, leaving only the space between their joined hands.
I meant every line of that poem. I've been meaning it since the first time you blushed.
I know, so did I all year.
Her hand, still trembling, squeezed back, a quiet, steady answer that needed no further words.
She's always been answering me in ink, in blushes, and now in this unbroken grip.
The world outside the window had darkened, but inside, their joined hands held the only light that mattered.
When I wrote the blog, I was writing to a ghost. Now you're the most real thing I've ever held.
Then let's rewrite the ending together. No more margins, just us on the page.
She nodded, and in that small motion, the year of hidden ink transformed into a single shared breath. Their hands remained intertwined as if the ink that had bound them for a year now flowed through their veins. They stepped out of the coffee shop into the cool evening, the world now painted in shades of deep blue and amber. Their hands stayed linked, a quiet promise carried between them as they walked. The familiar path to the library stretched ahead, now transformed into something sacred. In the distance, the library glowed, its windows holding the amber warmth of all the stories they'd shared inside. Misaki slowed and leaned her head against Kaito's shoulder, the gesture light as a whisper.
She's here, real and warm. The ink has become skin.
They passed under a street lamp, and for a brief moment, their long shadows merged into one. The library stood silent, its counter empty now, but its shelves still hummed with the echo of their secret language. Kaito glanced down at the girl who once seemed so fragile, now leaning against him with quiet certainty. They walked on, the night wrapping around them. No more silent pages, only a shared story still being written. They paused at an old wooden bench under a tree, the campus quiet around them. Misaki sat close, her shoulder brushing his, as if even the smallest distance was now unbearable.
The library will always be the loudest silence I ever heard.
She laughed softly, that airy sound now familiar, and it carried no fear, only affection.
A year ago, I was just a girl hiding behind a computer screen. Now I'm sitting with the boy who read between every line.
Kaito's mind drifted to that first folded note, the one wedged in the returned novel that started everything.
That slip of paper, filled with my own unspoken thoughts, it was her reaching for me before I even knew her name.
The street lamp above them flickered once, casting their joined silhouettes across the path like a permanent annotation. The campus clock tower chimed the hour, but neither stirred. This was a moment too long awaited to measure in minutes. He leaned back, letting the quiet settle around them. The same quiet that once held nothing now brimmed with everything. They rose from the bench, their hands still woven together as if they'd forgotten how to be apart. The night had settled fully now, a velvet backdrop for the quietest conclusion. Ahead, the library remained a glowing monument to all that had been whispered between its shelves.
It started with a note. It grew into a whole language. And now, it's just the beginning.
They paused at the foot of the library steps, neither willing to say goodbye to the place that had brought them together. The windows glowed, their light an echo of the golden lamp that had witnessed every blush. Then, without a word, they turned together and began to walk, not away from the library, but toward whatever came next. The library's quietest girl had asked the campus's quietest boy to coffee, and he had never heard a louder yes. The library stood behind them, its doors now holding more than books. It held a story that had finally found its voice. The next afternoon, Kaito walked into the library carrying a single paperback. The same counter, the same golden lamp, but the world around it had shifted. Misaki looked up from her scanner, and the blush that bloomed across her cheeks was no longer a secret. It was a greeting meant just for him.
Just one book today.
You don't need a mountain of books to start a story.
Their fingers brushed as she took the book, no longer a fleeting accident, but a quiet ritual of belonging.
I'm not stocking up anymore. I just wanted an excuse to see you.
You never needed an excuse. You always had my attention before you even walked in.
The scanner beeped, but neither flinched. The quiet that once held unspoken confessions now held all their spoken promises. Later, they walked out together under a sky that had seen 100 silent exchanges become a single lasting dialogue. The library's quietest girl had asked the campus's quietest boy to coffee, and in the end, the silence that remained was the loudest affirmation of all. A week later, they sat in the same coffee shop booth, but the silence between them was no longer a thing to be broken. It was a shared language, as comfortable as the worn leather seats.
I'm thinking of starting a new blog post tonight. Not anonymous this time. Maybe about coffee and the boy who makes me blush.
Make sure to include the part where he proposed in the margins of a vintage poetry book. That's essential.
2 lattes, one still with cinnamon, sat cooling on the table as they talked. A small detail, but it was proof they remembered the little things.
A year ago, I was just a lonely literature student hoping someone would understand an obscure reference. Now I have an entire person.
I still can't believe you read each of my blog posts and thought, I have to marry this girl.
I read your soul before I ever saw your face. The person was always going to be a revelation.
Her fingers found his across the table, and the simple gesture spoke more than any line of poetry ever could.
I used to think I'd always live in the margins, but you pulled me into the main text.
And in that small coffee shop, the quietest pair on campus kept writing their story, no longer in whispered margins, but in bold, full sentences. Months later, the library counter was no longer a place of trembling mysteries, but of familiar smiles. Kaito leaned against the wooden edge, waiting for Misaki's shift to end.
I still blush, you know, every time you walk in.
I know. I count on it. It's how I know the story's still being written.
Do you ever miss the mystery? The notes? The guessing?
Not even a little. I have the answer now, and she's standing right in front of me.
He reached across the counter and took her hand, the same hand that had once slid a phone number toward him with trembling fingers. Now it was steady, and the only trembling was the quiet hum of the library around them. They walked out together into the late afternoon, the library's golden light spilling onto the steps behind them like a benediction. And though the margins were now full of spoken words, every book they passed still whispered the memory of a girl who blushed and a boy who finally read between the lines. And in that quiet, the campus's quietest pair had found the loudest love story. A year later, the library still bore the same golden lamp, but everything else had shifted. The counter no longer held trembling mysteries, only the quiet routine of 2 people who had found their place in the world, and in each other. Kaito stood at the counter, not with a stack of books, but with a single hardcover. It was Misaki's first published novel, a love story born in the margins of a campus library.
I dedicated it to you. To the boy who read between every line.
You know everyone will think it's fiction, right? But I know better.
She laughed, that familiar, airy sound, and leaned over the counter to press her lips to his cheek, a quiet declaration that needed no words.
It's our story, Kaito. The library's quietest girl and the campus's quietest boy. And it all started with a blush.
They walked out into the afternoon, hand in hand, the same path they'd taken after their first coffee. The library stood behind them, no longer just a building, but the birthplace of 1,000 silent confessions. And though the blog whispered margins had long since gone quiet, its spirit lived on in the margins of every book they read together, and in the unwritten chapters they would continue to write, side by side. For in the hush of that old library, the quietest pair had spoken the loudest love. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the golden light. The library was quiet, the deep, contented quiet of a story well told. Kaito and Misaki sat side by side in a secluded nook, a single book open between them. They weren't reading, they were simply being together within the words that had brought them here.
Do you remember the first note? The one that said everything you'd never dared say?
I still have it. Folded in my copy of the vintage poetry book, the one with our ink intertwined.
Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice, a silent language that required no interpretation. The old library clock ticked softly, but time had ceased to press. They had learned to live within the space between heartbeats. Beyond the shelves, the golden lamp still burned, the same lamp that had witnessed every blush, every whispered confession, every silent vow. The library's quietest girl had become the center of a world built on ink and understanding, and the campus's quietest boy had found his voice in her silences. And as the afternoon faded into evening, the library held them in its amber embrace, a quiet reminder that the deepest love stories are written not in grand gestures, but in the trembling spaces between words. A single folded note, aged and worn, still rested within the pages of a vintage poetry book, a testament that in a world of noise, the quietest words often echo the loudest. As the afternoon deepened into the quiet amber of evening, Kaito closed the book between them and looked at Misaki with a smile that held no more secrets, only the profound certainty of home.
Ready to go home?
Our story started in these aisles. It still feels like home here.
They walked through the quiet stacks, hand in hand, past the counter where a blushing girl had once slid a phone number across the wood, and past the res shelving cart that had delivered their first forbidden note. Outside, the evening air was cool and calm, laced with the distant scent of autumn leaves and the faint trace of jasmine from her hair. She leaned into him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder, and they walked the worn path beneath the street lamps, the same path that had once carried only silence, now brimming with quiet joy. Behind them, the library stood in the twilight, windows aglow, a steadfast monument to all the whispered words that had built their world. And deep within, on a quiet shelf, a vintage poetry book held a folded note, the seed of a love story that had grown far beyond its margins, a quiet testament to the power of words left in the spaces between pages. For the quietest girl and the quietest boy had found that in love, as in a library, the most profound stories often begin with a whisper. The library had seen 1,000 love stories unfold between its pages, but none quite like this, a tale written not with ink alone, but with blushes, silences, and the delicate weight of a folded note. Kaito and Misaki still came here, not as seekers of hidden confessions, but as keepers of a quiet legacy. Every book they touched still whispered of the year when words bridged two silent souls.
Sometimes I wonder if another shy reader will find a note in a returned book and start a story of their own.
If they do, I hope they're brave enough to write back. It changed my life.
They strolled to their favorite corner, a quiet alcove where they'd once hidden from the world and found each other instead. The golden lamp still burned, a silent witness to the love that had started with a blush. And on a nearby shelf, tucked away in a vintage poetry book, the original note remained, its creases softened by time, its ink a permanent echo of a girl who dared to write her heart in the margins. Outside, the campus hummed with the rhythms of a new semester, but the library remained their sanctuary, a place where silence spoke louder than any voice, and where the quietest pair had built there forever. The girl who once hid behind a computer screen now walked hand in hand with the boy who read between every line, their story no longer confined to whispered margins but written boldly across their days. And the library, steadfast and timeless, held its breath in the golden dusk, content in knowing that the quietest love had become its loudest, most enduring tale. For every reader who ever felt invisible, this story was for you. The quietest words can echo forever, if you have the courage to write them. In the end, the library kept its secrets, but it also held their story, woven into each dusty sunbeam and every whispered page. Kaito and Misaki still came here, not as visitors, but as a quiet part of the library's endless, living rhythm. The original note remained, folded in a vintage poetry book, its creases telling the only love story that ever needed to be told. The golden lamp burned on, a steady witness to the quiet truth that the softest hearts often hold the deepest worlds. Beyond the windows, seasons shifted, but the library stood unchanged, a sanctuary for those who speak in ink. And behind the counter, a soft, violet-haired girl still blushed when a certain boy walked in, a tradition time could never erase. They walked home hand in hand, as they had 1,000 times, the path sacred with the memory of every silence they'd broken together. In the stacks, a new book waited, its pages blank, a quiet invitation for another shy soul to write in the margins. For the library's quietest love story was never about loud declarations, but about the enduring language of a blush, a note, and a yes that echoed beyond all words.